There's so much to say. I mean, I think, first of all, I share both of your kind of shock and horror about the killing of Anas al-Sharif, but also the 5 other colleagues who were with him when Israel attacked their tent outside of Al-Shifa hospital. Anas was only 28 years old. He was a son of Jabalia refugee camp. He spoke in his final letter about his dream of returning to his ancestral home, Al-Majdal, and to one day see his people be free. And it is so chilling to think that if Israel can attack so brazenly one of the most prominent Palestinian journalists in Gaza and get away with it, anybody is vulnerable. Anybody is a target for their killing. And I think in some ways it shouldn't be surprising and it shouldn't be shocking when we've heard so many documented reports of Israeli soldiers literally sniping babies and infants and children in the head. When you see, and Anas himself has covered some of the most horrific crimes imaginable, including his final report, which was about the starvation of children in Gaza, which he did from a hospital. He himself was the eyes and ears, along with his colleagues who were also killed, and it's important that we name them as well, as Sharif did, Muhammad Iqriqa, Ibrahim Zahir, Muhammad Nofal, Mu'min Al-Alawa, and Muhammad Al-Khalidi. It's important that the people behind the camera are also named and acknowledged. But they were the eyes and ears. They documented horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that's why they were targeted. Let's be clear. Israel is trying to silence those who are bearing witness and documenting this genocide. And they did. The timing also can't be ignored. It's when Netanyahu himself announced the expansion of the offensive in Gaza City. And again, if they can kill someone as prominent, as beloved, as well-known as Anas, everybody is a target. And we've seen this from the very beginning of the genocide. What the Israeli military has done in Gaza is turn the entire Gaza Strip, a place of 2.2 million people, into a killing field, a killing cage, where every single person is a target. Every killing is justified by the Israeli military, or they attempt to justify it. One of the things that stands out to me is what Al Jazeera's Tamer Al-Mishal said on the air on Al Jazeera Arabic, which is just I think the day before Anas was killed, he actually called his bosses at Al Jazeera and said, I need a break. I'm exhausted. I need a break. I'm physically exhausted. I mean, we should also say that he himself was starved, as everybody else in Gaza is. And he actually turned off his phone and rested for a bit. And it just shows you kind of his tenacity, his dedication to his work, his professionalism, that, most people would feel entitled to a break, but he actually asked for one. And I think what's been, again, not shocking given the media coverage since, I would say, preceding the genocide, but also since October 7th, which has been, much of the mainstream media, whether it's the BBC or the New York Times or CNN, have credulously repeated Israeli propaganda, talking points, sensationalistic, unverified claims. They've just repeated them without actually doing their own reporting and seeing whether there's any credibility to them. But we saw a report yesterday in the New York Times, which was especially vile, saying that, let's tell you about Al Jazeera, this news organization whose journalists were killed. And rather than focus on the wider context of Israel carrying out the largest killing spree of journalists in modern history. So more journalists have been killed in Gaza since World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. You're talking about a horrific, unprecedented situation. And rather than put these killings in the context of Israel's war on journalists, instead, you see a demonization of Al Jazeera, saying that Al Jazeera, quote, angered governments. Imagine an alternative scenario in which 5 New York Times journalists are targeted and killed, and Al Jazeera having a report saying, well, the New York Times angered governments. I mean, it's vile, it's disgusting, it's a clear attempt to justify Israel's attack on journalists. And, we've seen this actually from the very beginning. In October 2023, just 5 days after Israel killed the family of Wael al-Dahdouh, an Al Jazeera correspondent, they killed his wife and I believe 2 of his children. You saw the New Yorker publish one of the most vile pieces that has been published since the genocide, and that's saying a lot. And essentially what this piece did was try to paint Arabic language media, but particularly Al Jazeera, as propaganda, as echoing the language that Hamas uses. And it's just the most absurd and offensive framing. This was at a time when Israel had already killed 26 journalists. That was not worthy of covering. And instead, they tried to say that by using the word martyr, by saying Israeli occupation forces, by merely covering Israel's attacks, and by then 10,000 Palestinians had already been killed, by merely covering Israeli actions, that was propaganda for Hamas. I mean, the levels of evil in writing this piece, and again, at a time when Wael had just buried his own family, I don't even know what to say. I mean, you cannot disconnect the way that Western mainstream media has carried water for Israel, has dutifully carried its propaganda at every twist and turn of this genocide. You can't disconnect that from the killing and targeting and silencing of journalists in Gaza. The New York Times stands out as a particularly egregious place where you really can't take it seriously as a publication on this story, but on many other stories when you really dig deep. But I think, we know that actually The Intercept, I think, first reported, Jeremy and his colleagues back then, that the father of Joe Kahn, who's the executive editor of the New York Times, was actually a board member of Camera, which is an organization whose sole purpose is to intimidate and bully newsrooms into doing propaganda for Israel. And it's really clear that, the New York Times has had a long history of demonizing Palestinians, of being very pro-Israel, having these blind spots when it comes to this issue. But I think you've seen, particularly in this Joe Kahn era, that it's worse than it's ever been, or it's worse than it's been in a very, very long time. The example that you just noted, but also I believe Efrat Livni, the Israeli writer who wrote this piece on Al Jazeera, in a live blog previously referred to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which is a very right-wing Israeli position that actually shows that she believes that Israelis have a claim to all Palestinian land. So it shows you kind of maybe unintentionally where her biases and her own personal perspective is coming from. And we've seen that when they want to, the New York Times can show moral outrage. Evan Gershkovich sentenced to 16 years in Russian prison on fabricated charges. They call the espionage charges a sham. So when they want to, they can use very strong, clear language, journalistic language. They can have moral clarity. But when it comes to the assassination of Palestinian journalists, the largest killing spree of journalists in history, they work hand in hand with the Israeli military and government to try to justify these charges. And also, I mean, they have zero memory of even the last few months. I mean, we've seen even the Washington Post, which sometimes has its own blind spots, but is, I think, overall better than the New York Times, did an investigation into the killing of Hamza al-Dahdouh, a journalist who happens to be also the son of Wael al-Dahdouh, the Al Jazeera correspondent, and his colleague Mustafa Thuraya, who were assassinated by Israel because they were using a drone to take footage of, or to record footage of, the aftermath of an Israeli attack. After they informed the Israeli authorities of their work, they were targeted anyway. Israel initially tried to deny that they killed them, and then later on issued these documents similar to the documents that they tried to issue about Ismail al-Ghul and also about Anas al-Sharif, saying that Hamza was a member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group, that Mustafa was a member of Hamas. I mean, it's absurd, it's ridiculous, it's completely fabricated. And the Washington Post actually did a very detailed and thorough investigation into this killing and found that there's no grounds for these claims, that they were acting as journalists, of course, which is what they were when they were killed. So even in the face of all this evidence, going back even to the 2022 killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera correspondent in the West Bank, who was killed, and Israel, as we all know, tried to deny it, tried to lie and say that it was crossfire until, because it was the most investigated killing of any Palestinian in history, their backs were to the wall and they finally had to admit that they killed her. It was only because of that they finally admitted it, but they took no responsibility. No one was punished for it. And what followed was impunity enjoyed by Israel and given to them by the United States, even though Shireen was an American citizen. And of course, that's how they're able to get away with killing more than 250 Palestinian journalists in Gaza, because they enjoy this impunity. But none of this important context in history is ever covered or included in the media coverage of these killings. And I think you've seen an exodus. It's been very quiet of Arab and Muslim and people of conscience, reporters from many of these newsrooms, especially those with the most egregious records and most horrifying role in this genocide. And in terms of manufacturing consent and trying to build consensus for supporting the genocide. I remember I've been thinking a lot about this just the last day or so. At the beginning of the genocide, I was speaking with a reporter in one of these mainstream newsrooms. And I said, I noticed that you all use very emotive language when it comes to October 7th, but not when it comes to what's happening in Gaza. You see a very stark difference in terms of language. So with October 7th, brutal, barbaric, savage, massacre, they use the word massacre a lot. And her response was, well, October 7th was hand-to-hand killing, and that's why we use the word massacre, but in Gaza, it's killing from the air. And of course, that's absurd and on many levels. I think the basis of this ultimately is a deep dehumanization of Palestinians and a devaluing of Palestinian life, which is very clear in some of these conversations. But essentially, it also denies the reality, which is that Israeli forces have carried out very brutal massacres of Palestinians. And one of them happened in December of 2023, when Israeli, and actually Sharif and I covered in our documentary, along with our colleague Kavitha Shakuru, The Night Won't End, we covered one of these massacres of the Salem family, as well as other families that were in a building in Gaza City in December 2023. But there was another massacre of the Khalidi family, in which, and there are many of these field executions that happen in which Israeli soldiers come into Palestinian homes and essentially point blank shoot people. And in this massacre of the Khalidi family, of which 2 young boys survived, seeing the killing of their father and their pregnant mother, that was actually covered in Middle East Eye by Mohammed Iqriqa, who was killed along with Anas al-Sharif. A very long and detailed and thorough report on that execution. So just to bring this back to our topic at hand, the murdering of witnesses, I'm really fearful of what these mass killings of journalists will do in terms of how this genocide will be covered, who will tell the stories, not just of these atrocities and these crimes against humanity as they're happening, but who will tell the story after the genocide, who will write the books, who will write the journals, the diaries, the journalistic pieces chronicling the whole genocide, looking at the patterns, looking at specific incidents. It makes me really, it makes me feel like the future is very bleak, and that obviously brings to the fore Israel's intention behind these killings, which is to silence the truth and to get rid of the eyes and ears that are telling us what's happening.
Laila, I hope you don't mind me sharing, but when you and I were talking in the immediate aftermath of learning that Anas and our colleagues had all been killed, and we talked about this issue of, I think both you and I felt like if there was someone who would have been in an incredible position to tell the story of this genocide, it would have been Anas al-Sharif. And so many Palestinians I talked to and others said, like, they all thought he would be the one that could survive, that it just seemed unthinkable that he would be killed, even though he told us all that they were going to kill him. But you also said they don't want anyone left to tell the story anyway, that it's not even just about journalists or about the witnesses in this sense, that it does seem like the agenda is just to murder them all. Mm-hmm. Your family has lost more than 200 people. We have to remember that when we're speaking to you. You are a Palestinian, Laila. Your family has roots in Gaza and elsewhere in historic Palestine, and your mother's side of the family, just people register this as you listen to Laila talking. Her mother's side of the family has lost more than 200 of their relatives. I mean, and that's replicated with Palestinians the world over. Yeah, I mean, it's an exterminationist agenda.
My mom's cousin was walking with his 16-year-old son. It was his son's birthday, and a drone just came and bombed him and killed his son, and he was injured. I mean, there's just no words for the level of brutality. There's no words for the level of brutality. And the problem is Israel has so overwhelmed Gaza with just in terms of the levels of brutality. I mean, if in any other country, especially in the Western world, or if it was Israelis who were kicked out of their homes destroyed, and they were displaced 10, 15 times, that if they were starved, if their children were shot in the head while breastfeeding, if they were, you know, subject to multiple attacks. I mean, I think about just the fact that somebody like Enes, given everything he saw, was killed so far into the genocide. And I think about Dr. Rifat Al-Arian, who was killed in December of 2023. And, you know, some of the conversations Palestinians are having with each other now is like, wow, those people who were killed early in the genocide are the lucky ones. Because imagine seeing everything you've seen. And I just think we don't even think about just the details of it. Imagine smelling blood for almost 2 years, smelling blood, seeing, I mean, these journalists, but also just regular people who've survived this genocide have been subjected to some of the most brutal conditions of life imaginable. Just the smells of blood, the deprivation, being, you know, starved for months and months and months on end. I mean, let's be clear that this starvation didn't just start in March. They've been starved since the beginning of the genocide, when Israel announced to the world that they were cutting off water, food, and fuel from Gaza, along with other things like sanitary products and shampoo and soap, just the very basic things that make life what it is, that make life that are able to give you a life worth living, a life of dignity. They've completely stripped that away. And this is all by design. They want to break Palestinians down. They want to punish them. They want to kill them all, maim them. And I think, again, they've so overwhelmed Gaza and Palestinians with their brutality that I think if you actually break it down and look at the individual levels of brutality and barbarism, it's you know, overwhelming. And I think it's up to us to keep talking about it. As Enes told us in his final letter, we have to keep talking about Gaza. We can't stop talking about it. It's our moral duty, and it's the moral issue of our time. After almost 2 years of genocide, you feel like you run out of words to just express the horror and revulsion. But one thing I keep coming back to is I will never forget how journalists in the Western media shed tears over fabricated accounts about October 7th, fabricated stories about what happened to Israelis, and have just accepted as normal, or even in some cases support, the most depraved violence you can imagine against Palestinians that has been nonstop for nearly 2 years. It really breaks the brain, and it tests the soul to think about how dehumanization of an entire people can lend the same group of people to just accept, or can allow them to accept, depraved, horrific violence on the one hand, and then cry tears over fabricated atrocity propaganda intended to justify violence towards Palestinians. And I think this is something that the media industry has to reckon with from here on out. And as Sharif said, I think no one will look at these media institutions the same ever again.